further ado, I just want to tell you that I read Ward's book twice. The second time through, I had a strong emotional reaction to it. It's an outstanding book. It's an outstanding story by an outstanding man. But I had this sense that this is a man that has to say no to lots and lots of good things and good opportunities. Ward was the keynote speaker at the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, D.C. in 2009. He served in the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations. He is a man that has mobilized more genuine relief efforts to the continent of Africa than anybody that we probably ever will meet. Has a wonderful, true sense of what's important in life and what isn't. And without further ado, give him a warm Chippewa Valley welcome, Ward Brehm.
Thanks, brother. Can you hear me okay? I wish you could all be up here and be me and look out at you, because I can't tell you how encouraging it is to see this many men out on a Thursday noon to hear about, well, hopefully it'll be a good message. I need to provide some truth and disclosure despite that eloquent introduction. The real essence of who I am is a recovering type A former business owner. I'm often described by people, even those who like me, as often wrong but seldom in doubt. Today I've been asked to go through some of the topics that I wrote about in my book, Bigger Than Me. Just when I thought I had all the answers, God changed the questions. These are topics that we don't often discuss with others, sometimes not even with ourselves. Things like faith, ego, hypocrisy, gratitude, wealth, greed, death. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about what I call my great humbling. It's been said that if God wants to get your attention, he'll throw a little pebble into your life. If that doesn't work, he'll throw a rock. And that, as a last resort, he'll heave a brick. Africa was my brick. In 1994, Africa was not on my radar screen. In fact, the only thing on that radar screen was me. In the Los Angeles airport, I bought a copy of Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I didn't buy it to learn anything. I just wanted to make sure that he got them all right. But I was intrigued by Covey's notion of paradigms, that identical sets of facts can mean something totally different based upon your worldview. Somalia was in the news at the time. Countless numbers of Africans were dying from starvation. I felt no connection to this humanitarian crisis. My radar screen was full. Paradigms usually change because of shock or trauma. But I wondered, would it be possible for someone to change their paradigm on purpose? And then I supposed if I were to see someone starve to death, that would probably change my paradigm on starvation, and maybe much more. The thought left me nearly as quickly as it had come, but God sent me a reminder. 1 week later, I made one of my very occasional stops at church. My pastor, out of the blue, took me aside and he said, "Ward, I'm going to Africa in 2 months and I'd like you to go with me." I told him I couldn't believe the coincidence of the invitation based on my recent reflections on Somalia. And then I said, "No." He looked at me in a strange way and he said, "Well, would you at least pray about it?" And I looked at him back and I said, look, you're the pastor. You pray about it. I'll think about it. I'll either say yes or no. Well, he must have prayed awfully hard, because I found myself in the Minneapolis airport with a ticket to Ethiopia in my hand. I was surrounded at the gate. This is pre-9/11, where people could see you off at the gate. And I was surrounded at that gate by, for lack of a better word, church ladies. And they were hugging me. And then someone suggested that we pray before we got on the plane. So I found myself outside of Gate A, holding hands with a group of strangers. And I can tell you with all honesty that it was at that point in time that I said my first prayer. God, please don't let any of my clients see me. And then we flew 12,000 miles to Africa and 1,000,000 miles from my comfort zone. I had the high privilege of having my heart broken. I saw poverty on an obscene level, children with flies on their eyes, and for the lack of a 50-cent medicine, doomed to blindness. The emaciated faces of famine, families shattered by civil war. And in Masaka, Uganda, I held the hand of a 22-year-old mother as she died of AIDS, and then looked directly into the eyes of 4 totally bewildered, brand new orphans. I was an eyewitness. It put a face on the statistics. I always knew that those statistics were real. I always knew that they were true, but now they become real. It got personal. That trip changed my life forever. It taught me the seemingly obvious, important lesson that there are things in this world and purposes in my life that are far bigger than myself. And in being with some of the poorest people in the world, I was finally able to meet the real Jesus. I'll forever be indebted to Africa. Africa awoke me when I didn't even know I was asleep. One topic from my book that for sure I wasn't going to talk about today is ego, because it's a tough one for me, so I left it in. It's been said that sin is defined by its middle letter. As Rodney Dangerfield says, hey, I resemble that remark. Have you ever needed to get away from someone? I often feel that way about myself. But what can I do? Where can I go to get away? They say the grass is greener on the other side, but it's not, because once I get there, there I am. For me, losing myself means first acknowledging and then intentionally shedding the various masks and disguises that I wear so well. My default is often to become a chameleon, assuming different attitudes, different behaviors, depending upon the people that I'm with. Like many others, I determined that the first half of life is about success and a quest for success, and the second half of life about a search for significance. But how do we decide what that really means? We can all agree that money and power and all those things aren't all that they're cracked up to be. But what does it mean to be significant? For me, it meant making a positive difference in the lives of others, reflecting more, writing more, and a few other things. But I found the problem with significance is that it gets all tangled up with this issue of self. It becomes way too easy to make too big a deal out of my importance in the world. I was doing what I thought was all sorts of good things for God. At one point in time, I was actually convinced that God really needed me. It wasn't until later that I realized that the God who created the universe probably wasn't overly dependent on an insurance broker from Minneapolis. Significance can easily become just another form of pride. I found that often my quest to be relevant, earnestly helpful, was just ambition in a trickier disguise. And instead of relying on Jesus, I often don't pray enough, and I just charge ahead. My wife, Kris, and I had a conversation about this. She smiled and she told me, Ward, it seems of late that you've become partners with Jesus. I smiled back at the apparent compliment, and then she said, the only problem is you're the managing partner. I was going to talk next about the chapter on growing old. It's just too depressing. So I'm going to just leave it to Yogi Berra, who said, you may not feel as good as you used to be, but you're sure a lot better than you're going to be. And my mentor, Wheelock Whitney, who told me once, he said, you know, Ward, 80 is the new 80. On a lighter note, let's talk about death and mortality. I have a number of major medical conditions of my own that leave me with a highly compromised life expectancy. When I met with my hematologist 7 years ago, I gave the stoic, so how long do I got, Doc? He told me he wasn't God. He had no idea, and that I could be hit by a truck tomorrow. I pressed him, and I said, if I had a gun to your dog's head, what's the over-under? 10 years, he said. So then I asked the hypothetical question, what if I knew for a fact that I only had 10 years to live? Would it change my life? The answer was a resounding, of course. But then the much harder question, exactly how would it change it? I decided to put to paper a hypothetical document, and I called it my 10-year plan. I was blessed to have a mentor in Washington, D.C. by the name of Doug Coe, and I called him and told him both about my diagnosis as well as my plan. He said he wanted me to come out to Washington immediately to see him. Tomorrow, he said, and I did. When I sat down with him to talk, he asked me, did you bring along a copy of your 10-year plan? I was so happy. I said, of course I did. I pulled my plan out, handed it to him. Without even looking at it, just tore it to shreds. He said, a 10-year plan, he said, that is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard in my life. What you need is a 3-day plan. If you had 3 days to live, what would you do? And then do that for the rest of your life. Point taken. I know that I often take my own life way too seriously. If I could only grasp how soon I'll be forgotten, it would help. Tony Campolo once said, just remember that after you die, they're going to take you out to the cemetery, throw you in a hole, cover you with dirt, and then they're going back to the church and eating chicken salad. I talk in the book about the difference between following a religion and following Jesus. A lot of folks here may have a deep connection to Jesus, and others, not so much. Of course, your spiritual choices are up to you. But I want to offer some different, maybe some outside-the-box thinking on the most impactful person who ever lived. I begin with this assumption. Most of the way that we view Jesus is based upon where we were born and who raised us. I was raised a Christian in a Christian home. I went to church, I went through confirmation, and I became a member. But it didn't mean very much to me. I was a cultural Christian, and it had very little impact on my life or behavior. I think initially we see Jesus the way that we were taught to see him. If you were born in the South, it's a good chance you're a Baptist. If you're from Minnesota, maybe a Lutheran. If you're from Israel, you'd probably be a Jew. And if you're from Saudi Arabia, you'd no doubt be a Muslim. All of these varied backgrounds result in Jesus meaning many different things to many different people. But we like him better when we can customize him to our own preferences. For example, there's Jesus plus conservatism, or Jesus plus liberalism. But we need to remember that Jesus wasn't a Republican and he wasn't a Democrat. Perhaps surprisingly to some, Jesus wasn't an American. He wasn't a Catholic and he wasn't a Protestant. In fact, Jesus wasn't a Christian. He was Jewish, both by faith and creed. Therefore, when I define Jesus according to my own cultural beliefs, I end up putting him in a box. Attempts to hijack Jesus to conform to religious and cultural dogma have fueled misunderstandings, wars, division, hatred, in a word, alienation, both from God and one another. Let's consider Christianity itself. For 1,000 years, there was one church. Then in 1064, the breaking away of the Eastern Orthodox Church made it two. 500 years after that, the Protestant Revolution made it three. And as time went on, we really got the hang of dividing. The best guess is that today we have 33,000 denominations of Christianity. Each group presumably believes that it follows the real Jesus, and the others must have it wrong to a greater or lesser extent. Yet there's essentially only one scripture. Think of it, 33,000 variations on a theme. God just wanted us to know that he loves us, and out of that we've made chaos, wars, and vast alienation. Was this what Jesus intended? Small groups of people who think they have it right and that everyone else must be wrong? One of the best definitions of church that I've ever heard was to imagine what Jesus had in mind when he said to Peter, "On this rock I will build my church." I don't think he was talking about a denomination. I don't think he was talking about a building. But whatever Jesus intended when he said the word church is the church that I want to be a part of. Another of the great dividing points in theology is whether Jesus is the only way to heaven. I'm asked that question all the time. I always give the same answer: I don't know. I'm in sales, that's a management decision. When I posed the same question to Rick Warren, he said yes, Jesus is the only way to God. And he has 7 billion strategies of making himself known. I'm going with that. I found that the reason that people are most critical of the church or have left it altogether is because they've either had a bad experience or they've witnessed hypocrisy. Tragic stories of TV evangelists, serial child abuse covered up by high-ranking church officials. Yes, the church, like all of society, has plenty of hypocrites, as skeptics love to point out, but they're always the result, direct result of people. Nothing about Jesus or his teaching produces or supports hypocrisy. In fact, the only thing that made Jesus mad, table-tipping furious, in fact, was hypocrisy. And so often, I easily joined the chorus of outrage and indignation at that hypocrisy, until I realize that the biggest hypocrite I know is me. I recall that whenever I point 3 fingers at someone else, point a finger at someone else, I got 3 pointed back at myself. And Jesus himself saying that I will be judged by the same measure that I judge others. And sure enough, when I take a deep, long look into the very private depths of my own heart, unvarnished by rationalizations and excuses, I find that I no longer have an urge to cast the first stone at some fellow struggler of presumably more sinful pedigree. Another great question. If God is good, then why do bad things happen to good people? God's will is perfect. The problem is me. With the existence of sin and free choice comes consequences. Bad things happen. We live in a broken world where people suffer. I personally don't believe that God controls all circumstances. Does he control the rape of an 8-year-old girl by roving militias in eastern Congo? Of course not. Does God will that young mother in Uganda to die from AIDS and leave 4 helpless young orphans with no means of support? Ridiculous. Is God's heart broken by the same thing that break our hearts? I think so. Did Jesus weep? Yes. But I also believe that in everything that occurs, God is at work. That famous verse, Romans 8:28, gives us that promise. But Jesus never promised to deliver us from trouble, rather to be with us in that trouble. Another one of my mentors was fond of saying, don't ever miss the privilege of your problem. At first that sounded like total nonsense, but as I pondered the notion, I saw a great truth. Often my pain and suffering is the very thing that has brought my greatest personal growth. Indeed, suffering is a great instructor. In a world that's constantly distracting us with its frenzy of activity, pain and suffering make us stop. They force us to reflect and ponder. Suffering teaches us empathy, patience, and humility. And whatever doesn't make you bitter makes you better. It's been said that ours is the first generation on earth to try to find heaven on earth. It's not going to happen. We live in a broken world and it's filled with broken people. Bad things always have and always will happen. But thankfully, that's not even close to the end of the story. Next, I was going to talk about the poor. After all, Jesus talked more about the poor than any other topic, except one. Take a guess.
Money.
Yay, money. So here goes. My paradigm on money began to shift many years ago in a discussion with my mentor, Wheelock Whitney. Knowing that he had a lot of it, I asked him out to lunch, and I asked him to share his philosophy on money and inheritance. He quickly replied, I'm assuming the real agenda is how to take some of my money and make it yours. I said, save that agenda for a later day. But I really wanted his firsthand knowledge and insight. He said, we all know what money can't do. Money can't buy love, can't buy happiness. Very, very few people realize the one thing that money does do. And it only does one thing. Money provides choices. And if you're capable of making good choices, money can be an incredible blessing. And if you're incapable of making good choices, money will no doubt become a terrible curse. So I began to explore the difference between those of us who have a lot of choices and those among the poor who have none. And the questions kept coming. When I ask the question, "Are you rich?" almost everyone says no. When I ask that question of myself, my answer is no as well. My wife Kris and I are blessed not to have to worry about money anymore. But we think that our definition of enough is both understated and reasonable. So we aren't rich, we're just comfortable. As I pondered it a while, I realized that my definition of someone rich is someone who has a lot more money than I do. I've tried this little experiment before with astonishing results. People with net worths of $1 million, 10 million, 100 million all consider themselves affluent. Very few actually consider themselves rich. The truly rich are people that have more wealth than they do. Bigger estates, larger companies, bigger yachts, airplanes. I clearly needed context. So I decided to research what being rich means comparably for the population of the planet. If you own a car, any car, you're among the top 20% richest people in the world. If you earned $1,500 last year, you're in the top 20% of the world's income earners. If you have $60,000 in assets and or earn $25,000 a year, which is just above the poverty line in America, you're in the top 10% of the world's wealthiest people. If you earn more than $50,000 last year, or have over $500,000 in assets, congratulations. You're part of the richest 1% wealthiest people on the planet. I don't know about you, but these facts make me realize that I'm not only rich, I'm crazy, crazy rich. The next question was, so whose money is it anyway? Mine. Of course it's mine. I really worked hard all my life. I've earned every penny that I have. I've made good financial choices. Of course it's mine. That position was severely tested by my mentor, who one day was uncharacteristically complimenting me on my business career. Ward, you always made the right moves. Every step of the way you made great decisions. And then he slipped in, what I'm trying to figure out is how you pulled off the most brilliant decision of all. Actually, it was the decision that made everything else possible. I had a feeling a shoe was going to drop. How were you able to orchestrate being born into Edina, Minnesota, an affluent suburb where you never once worried about going without almost anything, and had two terrific parents? Point taken. We all like to tell stories of lifting ourselves up by our own bootstraps. But you could be born in a famine and disease-ravaged African village, a place where nobody knows what a bootstrap is, let alone have one. Or you could be born with a silver spoon in your mouth, with every advantage awaiting you, including education, medical care, exciting career possibilities. You're born where you're born. Everything I have is a gift, including my next breath. It's been said that a self-made man worships his maker. I now find the notion of being independently wealthy ridiculous. The reality is I don't own anything. I'm only a temporary steward. Then, of course, that troubling statement, again, straight out of Jesus' mouth. To whom much has been given, much will be expected. The question for me is, how much am I supposed to give? What amount would be sure to please God and assure me that I'm not greedy? I've always given a lot of money away. I consider myself equally generous with both my time and my money. But then I recall Jesus talking about generosity and telling the story about wealthy people who make a big show out of their giving, while the poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. Jesus telling them that she'd given more than anyone, saying they all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything. That radically changes my paradigm. I'm supposed to give sacrificially. Ouch. As I reflect back on my life, I cannot honestly recall making a donation or a commitment that was so large that it actually impacted my lifestyle. A gift so big that I had to make a sacrifice of something else that I either needed or wanted. I give out of my wealth, but not out of my poverty. Brought up an even more troubling question. So am I greedy? Once again, I think I reflect most people's thinking. I'd say especially in this room, that my answer was no. In fact, I consider myself generous. It's the greedy person falls into the same category as the rich. Someone with way more money than me. They're the ones who should be giving more, not me. They're greedy, not me. Oh, really? I have tried every possible way to rationalize my way out of this. But I'm reluctantly coming to a very uncomfortable conclusion. I'm rich and I'm greedy. Yikes. Is anybody else getting a headache in here? Don't worry, I'm almost done. In closing, I was talking to a very good Hindu friend, and while we were comparing faiths, he asked me a very simple question. How is it possible to obey what your Jesus himself said was the first and most important commandment? In other words, how do you love God with all your heart, soul, and strength? Literally. I'd never asked myself that question before. I didn't have an answer. My mind was completely blank. I was deeply embarrassed, and I told him that I'd get back to him. So I'm going to ask you the same question. How do you love Jesus with all your heart, soul, and strength? Tangibly. It's harder than you thought. After giving this a lot of thought, I looked it up, and I saw something that I had never noticed before. Right after giving that first commandment, Jesus said, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. A wheel clicked into place. Of course. The answer is the only real and tangible way to demonstrate my love for God is to love my neighbor. Which leads me to the final question. It's the one that I ask every time I'm asked to speak on behalf of neighbors in need. For the little girl who is raped by the roving militia in eastern Congo, or those bewildered orphans in Uganda who watch their mother die from AIDS, what's God's strategy for letting them know that He is good? Or people that we know closer to home, right here in Chippewa Falls, facing issues like addiction, poverty, disease, despair. Why would they think God is good? And more importantly, what's God's strategy for letting them know that He is good and that He loves them? The answer is astounding. The answer is us. And even more astonishing is that God does not have any plan B. Thank you.
We have just a couple minutes, and I asked Ward if he'd be willing to take a few questions, and I'll start off by just asking one. In your book, you account for, in your travels, being warned not to bring religion into the conversation in Africa, but then when you shifted the subject to Jesus, you got a completely different response, and I think that's a transferable and relevant principle for our men as well. You want to share that story?
Yeah, actually, I'll share it in the form of a story. Traveling particularly among leadership in Eastern Africa, coming as a group of Christian leaders, we wouldn't get in the door. Coming as followers of Jesus, all sorts of doors opened up. And a tangible story, I was in Rwanda not long after the genocide. It was 1997 with Senator Durenberger from Minnesota. And we met with President Kagame, who is the newly elected president of Rwanda, to oversee this vast destruction and rebuilding of his country. And when he walked in the door, I was really disappointed. I'm thinking, here's this guerrilla rebel fighter, this freedom fighter, and he looked like a chemistry professor. He's about 6'5" and just skinny as a rail with these glasses. He was a goofy-looking guy. And he sat down, and we were, Dave's the senator, I'm the business guy, and he's talking about the socio-economic impacts, and there's a lull in the conversation. I said, Mr. President, what's the role of the church in rebuilding your country? And I saw the rebel fighter. He came across the table. I mean, his eyes were blazing, and he said, absolutely none. He said the church failed. I mean, the church was complicit in the genocide. I mean, he was really, and I got a little kick under the table from Durenberger. And so we moved on to transportation issues, etc. And then about 10 minutes later, I said, Mr. President, do you feel as though there's a role for Jesus in the reconciliation of your country? And I got kicked by Durenberger so hard, I still have a bruise. It was completely different. Sat back in his chair, huge smile on his face. He said, of course there's a role for Jesus. If our country had been following Jesus, this never would have happened. And it's happened time and time again. The president of Mauritania, the Republic, the Islamic Republic of Mauritania, 99.999 Muslim. I had some time alone with him, asked if we could talk a little about Jesus. The U.S. ambassador kick me in the shins. I got sore shins. This president said, of course, we'd love to talk about Jesus. We always talk about things that we are different. We never talk about what we have in common. That was actually insightful. He said, you know, you Christians may not know, but we Muslims revere Jesus. He's number one. We believe he's the only prophet that's going to come down to earth. He was born of a virgin. There are a lot of things that we believe that you believe. He goes, you know, it's the three thing that we get hung up on. You know, there's only one true God. Anyway, we fist bumped. It was fun. And Jesus was in the room, and the ambassador said, I've never, in my life, 30 years of foreign service, I've never been involved with a leader, with a discussion with a head of state like that one. Why do you think that was? And I said, it's because the Holy Spirit showed up. You know, Jesus' name, the power of that name is incredible.
I'll throw it out to the floor in a second. I have one more, because we have a few minutes. So, never was there a bigger need for something that I found very compelling about your life and the small group that you meet with, and the Bible studies you've had in Washington, D.C., where, you know, we are getting the extreme zealot positions of both parties that is causing great division in our country. And you seem to have been able to navigate a path to be in agreement on Jesus and disagree agreeably and still have common union with people from both sides of the aisle. Can you share some insights into
Sure.
how to navigate that?
Yeah, there's actually a model. Very few people know about it, but every Wednesday morning in the U.S. Capitol, about 30 U.S. senators meet for breakfast to pray together. It's about half Democrat, half Republican. The rules of the meeting are you leave the briefcase, leave the no aides, no staff, no agenda, no politics, everything, and you just come in and share your lives. And it's one of the most effective bridges, in Washington, D.C. The House does the same thing on Thursday mornings. There's actually a model that they use for that. That was one of the reasons I was with Dave, is trying to encourage these small groups of people of different political parties being able to get together as friends. And it's very, very powerful what happens. So I started one of these groups with Wheelock Whitney, and we decided that it had to be 50% Republicans and 50% Democrats. And I'm a Republican, Wheelock's a Republican, so we had to get some Democrats. So we got Wendy Anderson, who was the former governor of Minnesota, who's a Democrat, and Warren Spanis, who was the former Attorney General of Minnesota, who was a Democrat, to balance it out on our way to eventually having 12 people. Now, in my head, this will tell you how little my head is, but I always thought, not consciously, subconsciously, that if you were a Democrat, you were either dumb or you were out to wreck stuff. It's interesting, Democrats feel the exact same way. But I really kind of felt that. I never expressed it, I never thought it, but I really kind of, and then I met Warren Spanis. I mean, this guy's way smarter than me, and at least 2 or 3 times more compassionate. And what I came to realize was that in these national debates and in these unbelievable, I mean, it's gotten out of hand, I think we'd all agree, almost always we can find agreement on the goal. We just have different strategies to achieve that goal. And that takes a lot of the nastiness out of it. And we have, but we to this day, I mean, when I was just in Eastern Congo, I was in Kinshasa, the capital, meeting with groups from about 40 different political parties, and I said, you know, if Republicans and Democrats can do this, Hutus and Tutsis can too. And it really is true. It's universal. The key is to lift up Jesus' name without any regard of what people think of him, what their viewpoints are, is just the idea, because Jesus said, when 2 or more gather in my name, I'll be there. And he's good to his promise. He'll show up.
Tell the Betty McCollum airplane story when she asked about how you ever got in the position you're in.
I don't know, Betty McCollum is a Democrat congresswoman from St. Paul and a good friend of mine. And when I go on airplanes, I'm one of these grumpy guys that doesn't like to talk. I look every bit of my body language is, I don't like you, I don't want to talk to you, I don't want to meet you, I put my paper up, just leave me alone, put my earphones in. So we're getting ready to take off, and I'm on the phone, and I'm just going, I'm on some call, and I'm really on it. They say, okay, hang up, so I hang up the phone, and immediately pull out my iPad, and I hear this voice that says, boy, you're a busy guy. And I look, and sitting next to me is Betty McCollum. I go, gosh, Betty, hi. And we started talking. She goes, how did you get to be chairman of the U.S. Africa Development Fund? It's a presidential appointment. And I said, yeah. Just, how'd you do that? And I said, well, what do you mean? She said exactly what I said. I mean, I have no idea. How could you possibly get that done? And I said, well, I know a little bit about Africa. She goes, no, I know that. But how did you get cleared by a Republican president? How did you get appointed by a Republican? I said, Betty, I'm a Republican. No. No. You're joking. You're not a Republican. I said, I am a Republican. I've been a Republican all my life. She goes, well, you don't sound like a Republican. You don't act like a Republican. I said, well, how many have you talked to lately? Dead silence. And Jim Ramstead, a good friend of both of us, was just across the way on the airplane, and she said, I so envy him. Because in his day, they didn't caucus, they didn't group. Everybody met once another. You'd come in and you'd yell and scream and swear at each other, and then you'd go out and have a Manhattan and a steak over dinner, and those days are long gone. But anyway, it's about personal relationships, and it's so easy for us to demonize people with different ideas, different perspectives, and different viewpoints. And these groups are ways to that really allow people to bring together. There's John Dearest, who was the head commissioner of the Hennepin County Commission, great big burly guy from northeast Minneapolis. I mean, he's a man's man. And I invited him to come, and just to see if it had an interest to him. He goes, you know, I'm going to tell you guys right here, if you think I'm going to hold hands with a bunch of guys and start crying, I'm the wrong guy. A month later, he's holding hands and crying. Anything else?
Anybody have a burning question? Mark? That's Mark Helverson that you talked to on the phone.
Hey.
Teamwork Africa, WWIB.
Hey.
And Leading with Power, original partner.
I just want Keith to introduce myself. It seems like higher priority. One of my favorite quotes is, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, freedom, and in all things, love. And it seems like you really embody that. And it seems like the division so often in Wisconsin or nationally comes over. We say, to heck with higher priorities. I just want to fight because this means more to me maybe than Jesus would say it should. So can you speak to that?
The political differences are a tough one because it's a circus. I mean, there's just no question about it. I mean, we've reached a point in our country. I'm in Washington. I spent quite a bit of time in Washington, D.C., where senators and members of Congress literally aren't speaking to one another. They'll pass by in a hall. They won't even acknowledge each other's presence. There's a lot of passion. There's a lot of histrionics. There's a lot of division. There's a lot of alienation. And when you think about it, that's one of the primary reasons for Jesus coming. As followers of Jesus, those of us who proclaim to follow Jesus, we've got some pretty serious marching orders. Because if you remember, the quote, "They will know us by our love." So when you have two people following Jesus screaming hysterically at each other, calling each other names, the opposite is true. They won't know him by our hatred or by our discord. One of the rules of these groups is we can discuss anything, but we won't argue about anything. And I think what has happened is a lack of respect for other people's opinions, other people's, and when you really pick out the biggest jerk you know, pick out the person that you have the least in common with. Yeah, this will be your assignment. It's like a teacher. Okay, so now the homework is pick out someone. You probably have that person in your mind right now. If not, just keep until you really come to the last person that you would like to be with, and invite them out for coffee or stop by and see them with a simple introduction of saying, I don't know you very well, and I just wanted to take the opportunity just to find out a little bit more about who you are, right? What I have found is that when I feel that way about somebody, this is really a coincidence, they usually feel the same way about me. I think somebody's a jerk, there's a pretty good chance, right? Pretty good chance. And I have done that. There was an exercise on forgiveness. And there was no way I was going to forgive this person for what he had. No way. You're asking too much. And I heard a sermon and a challenge much like this, and I did it. And I can't tell you, it was almost a 2.5-hour discussion. I discovered things about that person I had no idea. I saw reasons behind behavior. I saw all sorts of things. It's not like he's my best friend, but whenever I see that individual, we have a hug. So it's possible. It's absolutely, totally impossible for the political parties to unite, but it's very, very possible for us, particularly those who profess to follow Jesus, to take the lead and do that.
I think we're going to wrap it up now, but I do want to encourage you that there are some copies of an outstanding book that Ward has written called Bigger Than Me, and can you stick around just for a few minutes at the book table and do that? There's also the copies of 20 Lessons That Build Leadership, but I want to, if any of you have been stirred about your stewardship opportunity, and about being all in and being generous and giving, I just want to point out some people in the room. Chad, wait, where's Chad? Chad's here, where are you? Stand up, Chad. Chad, what's that, the Prisoner Project? What is it called? The Pen Project. Chad has he and his wife have an outstanding, interesting ministry where they compile literature, writings, and paintings from prisoners in our prisons, and they put out a newsletter 4 times a year? Monthly? Yeah. And it requires funding for them to get that done, but and then they put the gospel in this newsletter that they distribute to the prisons all across Wisconsin. It's a really cool, unique, and interesting thing that they would appreciate some donations for. There's people here from Hope Gospel Mission. I saw quite a few over in this corner. Want to raise your hands? They're always on the front lines of helping the needy in our community, and I know that they're still cashing checks as far as I can remember. And of course, Mark and Peggy Halverson and Teamwork Africa is a noble cause that, and I realize I'm going to leave some of you guys out, but we always like to, we never ask for money, but we also have never failed to cash a check. But we love to support you guys who are leading with Power Guys and have been coming and are faithful, and we want to promote your business, we want to promote your cause, and we want to help you get the word out. So I know of those 3 for sure. If you want to talk to them today, afterwards, maybe they could gather up here with our very military-looking book salespeople. Somebody told me that these shirts look like it's the sheriff's department. And I'm okay with that. Hey, it's been great. We've got an exciting year planned already. Some great speakers lined up. Gary Thomas is coming in October. Many of you know the name Gary Thomas, nationally known speaker, marriage guy. And I encourage you, come back tonight to River Prairie Center, either to eat or not to eat, and join with us tonight in this tabletop discussion of 50 things you taught us. It was a great season. I know that some of you, they might have trouble knowing this, but we love you, and you are an answer to prayer, and you're the reason why we exist. So thanks, and have a great summer.